developing a really strong middle leadership team who can drive inclusion. And I hope that some of these resonate and are applicable to your own context. Then we'll look at how we built capacity so that our middle leaders are supported to drive inclusion, different inclusion priorities. And then I'll explain some of the strategies we've used to strengthen the practice of our subject leaders. And then some final points about what we do to ensure that inclusion is always on the agenda. And we'll finish up with some questions. So our school context, we're a co-educational comprehensive academy in Shoreditch, which joined the Mulberry Trust in 2018. We were judged outstanding in our last Ofsted inspection, which was in 2012. For a period of time, we assessed ourselves as good after kind of quite a few changes, but we have recently moved ourselves from good to outstanding in our 2020 CEF in all categories. We have 1,140 pupils on roll from year 7 to year 13. And we're proud to say that we were recently designated a Centre of Excellence by the Inclusion Quality Mark. Situated in Tower Hamlets, we serve a very diverse community, and many of our students face a number of significant barriers to achievement. Especially in this context, it's a real priority for us to avoid any fixed term exclusions. In terms of outcomes, our pupil premium students do very well, but we're still working to close the gap between students with special educational needs and their peers. So I imagine that part of why you're here today is because inclusion is such a big piece of work which touches everything that we do in schools. When I talk about inclusion in this presentation, I'm going to be focusing specifically on the student experience in lessons and on their access to enrichment activities. We do have an absolutely brilliant SENCO and inclusion department, but my focus today is on how we ensure that all of the other members of our school are driving inclusive practice. So what defines our approach to growing middle leaders who drive on inclusion is partly the imperative to create an equitable experience for students. So we endeavour as much as possible to give them what they need to thrive in spite of any of the disadvantages that they might face. We also want to develop and retain our staff in a way that is affordable, that makes them feel valued and confident in their work. And we also want them to work together as a team because we've seen through experience what a powerful impact this does have on their practice. And above all, we want to feel confident in the professional excellence of our middle leaders. So this leads us on to thinking about what some of the challenges are in achieving a vision like this. I'd like to hear a bit more about your own experiences, and I'll give you a minute or so, but please do comment to share any of the challenges that you and your teams might have faced around these areas in your context. Yeah, certainly. Okay, so we've got the gap looking like it's widening after lockdown. Historically, micromanaged middle leaders and leaders being at different stages. Schools being very large, lots of staff being on the journey, yeah, and literacy. Okay, right. So thank you so much for sharing your ideas. I'm really pleased to see that there's some crossover with some of the challenges that we've faced. For us, we have lots of new middle leaders who are taking on a challenging role for the first time, which means that they really need specific guidance to develop their practice. And also where we have more experienced leaders, sometimes it can be a challenge to ensure that they have the same level of motivation to improve their practice as those who are new in role. Also, because subject leaders have such a challenging role, we know that we need to manage the demands on their time and support them in driving different aspects of inclusion. And when it comes to training or growing the leadership team, obviously finding a balance between expense and impact is a key concern for all of us. And finally, the main challenge is really for us that we feel that we'll never be done with improving inclusive practice. So in a moment, I'm going to talk about some of the steps that we've taken to broaden that middle base of people who lead on inclusive practice in our school, so that addressing inclusion priorities doesn't just fall on subject leads and pastoral leads alone. Before we do that, though, I'd like to ask you now to spend a moment to reflect on specific aspects of inclusive practice that you think your middle leaders struggle to drive because of capacity. So that could be subject leaders, pastoral leaders, and other middle leader roles. So if I give you 2 minutes again, so please do add your ideas in the chat. I know that somebody's already mentioned literacy. And the widening gap after lockdown, those may be two things that you feel apply in this context as well. But any other ideas would be interesting to hear. Yeah. If I think what I'm going to do, because I'll come back at the end maybe when it comes to questions to talk about how we've tried to tackle some of the challenges posed by COVID, but the majority of what I'm going to talk about today is the work that we sort of started last year before lockdown and are continuing to work on in school. But I will come back to talking about how we've adapted that in lockdown at the end. Okay, so thinking back to kind of more historically and like the journey that we've been on, in our case, there are a number of areas where we felt it would be useful to expand that middle base of people who lead on inclusive practice, both by creating a number of unpaid opportunities for non-post holders to have an impact on whole school practice, but also by investing in actually expanding our middle leadership team. So we've created a number of working party groups, each of which is led by a senior leader and a team of teachers from different departments. And these teachers then become the champion for that inclusion priority within their department. And they take responsibility for leading the other teachers in that department to improvement. So these parties usually meet every 2 weeks, and the participating staff then lead a running agenda item on it in their department meetings. It works for us because it both supports the head of department, and it's also also good leadership development for these teachers. And generally, we're lucky that our staff respond really well to being offered opportunities like this. So actually, in addition to these working parties, I'll just say that the Careers and Enterprise Working Party has not actually launched yet, but what we have had and what we started over lockdown, and then since we came back from lockdown, was a extended learning working party as well. So trying to join up some of the conversation and support to teachers in different departments around teaching remotely. We also have a broad range of professional development programs at the school, a weekly 15-minute morning briefing on teaching and learning, that's for all teachers, a weekly beginner teacher and NQT meeting, and also a recently qualified teachers program, and they meet every 3 weeks. We do ask teaching staff who are not middle leaders to present at these sessions on inclusion topics like stretch and challenge, motivating harder to reach students, and academic literacy. Also, as a rule, we try to recruit the best quality teaching assistants, and on their contracts, their working hours go beyond the school day, with the expectation that they will take on additional responsibilities like running clubs and interventions. We have a really strong history of retaining and developing these staff into teaching and TLR positions. We actually have a current head of house, head of year, a teacher, an assistant head of year, and an assistant Senko, who were all originally teaching assistants with us. And we're really proud of the fact that they've grown and gone on that journey here. So the other way that we've broadened our middle base is by creating a very broad pastoral team. And this is obviously an expense, but it makes sense for our context, because we see the need to invest money here because of the high level of pastoral need, and also because we have a very ambitious approach to enrichment. Every year group has a head of year and an assistant head of year, which is a long-standing system that's existed at the school for as long as I've been here, which is 8 years. But a recent change and investment was the creation of a house system. So this was introduced in September 2019, and the vision behind it was to use competitions, events, rewards, and opportunities for student leadership to create a really strong sense of fun and belonging, and to give our students a really unbeatable enrichment and personal development experience. So essentially, it was a system that was created to drive inclusion. And we're really proud of the impact that it's had already, and how fantastically it's been led by the newly recruited house team, these 6 middle leaders. And just to give you a bit of flavour of all of the fun, here's a slide capturing some of the house events from the first half of last year. And what happened when we went into lockdown was actually that they took all of these events online and hosted them through YouTube and through our virtual learning platform. So yeah, from an inclusion perspective, the house team also take a lead on tracking and analysing the student participation in all of the house activities, and they have an action plan for raising the participation of less engaged groups. So really, I could give a whole presentation on the impact of the house system, but essentially the point that I want to make is that we see enrichment as an integral part of our approach to inclusion. So now that we've discussed some of the ways that you can remove some of the pressure on subject leaders to drive different aspects of inclusive practice, I want to turn now to how it is that we actually develop our heads of department to be truly outstanding in the bread and butter of their role, which is curriculum design, leading their teams to deliver outstanding teaching and learning, securing excellent outcomes for all student groups, rigorous monitoring, and swiftly addressing any concerns that arise out of that. And I'm pleased to say it's taken me so long to mention this, but also them being able to clearly articulate all of these things to anyone, but particularly to an inspector. So firstly, our current head introduced very rigorous data meetings with subject leaders when she joined us in 2018. We input student data termly for Key Stage 3 and half-termly for Key Stage 4 and 5. For these data meetings, subject leaders prepare an analysis of this data, and they present it together with their line manager to the principal, the deputy principal, and who's in charge of outcomes, and the head of year. And the mantra behind these meetings is actually that data is students, meaning that the conversations are really just about who is not on target, why they're not on target, and what's already being done to address this, and what other interventions would be useful. It's an exercise which supports subject leaders to be really knowledgeable and proactive about performance in their areas, but it's also an exercise which means that the head of year, the head of outcomes are extremely knowledgeable about everything that's going on in department areas, and that makes the heads of department feel really supported. So secondly, as I'm sure is the case in your schools, we do have some subject leaders who are clearly stronger in their role than others. And in some cases, we've paired a stronger subject leader with one who could learn from their example in their line management groups. So that some of those line management meetings can be conducted together in these pairs. And we found that creating these pairings can be particularly powerful in motivating or improving the professionalism of some subject leaders who might be more inclined to make excuses or complain instead of being proactive. They then really learn from this example of their peer who's doing absolutely everything that they should be doing, and showing them that it's possible. Thirdly, obviously consultancy is an expense, and until recently I wouldn't necessarily have recommended it as a meaningful or value for money approach to professional development, but we have recently had a really positive experience in working with someone for a whole year. And she's an ex-HMI inspector, and it all started when we asked her to conduct a mock review focusing specifically on more able students. And she did this together with our teaching and learning team, and then we decided as a follow-up from that we'd like her to continue to work on this focus with our middle leaders for a longer period of time. So then she began to join us in our weekly middle leader training sessions and lead sessions around curriculum design, curriculum interviews, work scrutiny, student focus groups, ensuring that the curriculum is diverse, that it's inclusive, that online learning is doing the best that it can for students, and other ways of reaching students who are learning remotely. But because she does this type of work with lots of schools, what was so powerful for us was that she has such a broad experience and is able to be a critical friend who has a much better understanding of the bigger picture outside our school than we do. And that's been really important for us in a period of change, where it sometimes felt quite challenging to keep up with all of the new hoops that we need to be jumping through. So it's been helpful to have an external perspective. And a key thing that we've learned from her that's been particularly powerful, and that I would recommend to anyone, is the way that she uses student interviews to inform her judgment of the school. And this has had a real impact on our practice. And now student focus groups have become absolutely front and centre of all of our monitoring. And we find that they often do give a bit of a different picture than necessarily looking at the students' books or looking at the data or observing the lessons, because one of the things that is really important to us is making sure that our students have like metacognition skills and they're really articulate. And so what we did find when we started to do more of these student meetings was that there was more work to be done in developing that in our students. So just to come back to the point of this idea of making consultancy work for your needs if you use it, I just want to say that we made this decision to invest in this longer project with a consultant because at that time we had a lot of subject leaders who were new to role, And we felt that our teaching and learning team alone wouldn't be enough to bring those leaders on as much as we needed to in that space of time. And it turned out to be a really fortunate investment that we'd made, because then when lockdown happened, we did have, it was a great time for curriculum leaders to work together to continue to make changes to their curriculum and improve their curriculum. So yeah, and we went with someone who we'd already seen from the initial review that she conducted, that she was really great to work with and absolutely brilliant at what she does. So fourthly and finally, with regards to developing our subject leaders, internal curriculum reviews are something that we started doing in the summer of 2018 as a way of really taking a thorough look at how subject leaders and their teams were implementing the new curriculums that they were actually still in the process of redesigning at that time. And in many cases, they still are in the process of redesigning them. These reviews very much mirror the deep dive, but that is also because we do feel that all of these monitoring activities are really useful for us. We originally started running these as a team of senior leaders, but what we realised was that we as a senior team were becoming more and more confident with this process of review, and clearer as to exactly what it was that we were looking for. But as we were looking at a new department each time, we were often finding that the subject leaders were not as polished and prepared and confident in talking about all of the great work they do as we want them to be. So what we decided to do was to alter the programme so that each review involved a lot more middle leaders in each step of the process, so that they could be in the position of the reviewer, and that would help them grow in confidence as to what is expected. And then they can use this to improve their general monitoring in their department areas, and also be more prepared for their own reviews. So yeah, we just feel that involving the middle leaders as reviewers in that really like catalyzes and accelerates their progress. Our most recent reviews were actually not subject focused, but they were focused on SEND and stretch and challenge for all students across subjects. I've shared some of the documents that we use for these reviews with Rebecca in case they're useful, and she or Aziz will send them out to you after the session. So those are a list of questions that we ask the students, curriculum questions, and an example programme of how we conduct these 2-day reviews. So finally, a quick word on how we keep inclusion on the agenda at school. I've already mentioned most of these things, but I will just summarise. So our working parties are all focused on inclusive practice and involve a wide range of staff, so that inclusion is not just led by subject leaders. Our SENCO is really active in delivering trainings for staff in all of our professional learning programs, and she does this every half term to either to all staff or to the beginner teachers or to the recently qualified teachers. So that helps to really keep inclusion on the agenda. Our curriculum reviews also are always examining the inclusivity of our practice, and the outcome of them is clear action plans, and we use these as a mechanism for developing middle leaders as well. We also apply for inclusion awards, and the next one we plan to apply for is the Fig Tree Race and Conscious Equality Charter Mark. And we also take an inclusive approach to enrichment, and we actively try to broaden participation. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, actually closing the gap, the attainment gap for students with SEND is still a target area for us. And one of the ways that we plan to tackle this is to maximise the impact of our UPS teachers. we're implementing a specific training program to ensure that our UPS teachers are really fulfilling every aspect of their job description, because actually their job description looks like that they should be contributing a lot to curriculum design, contributing to CPD. So we are planning to use their expertise within this training program to really focus on inclusive teaching and make sure that they're really fulfilling every aspect of the role that they should be fulfilling. Also, much like we felt like our middle leaders learn so much from being involved in the process of a review, we also introduced a whole school trios observation program for all staff, which is very informal, but it involves groups of 3 teachers, and they may be at completely different levels in the organisation, but they go and observe one another as peers, and give feedback to one another. And you know, in terms of inclusive practice, I think this is a really lovely thing, because it's people from different phases of the organisation working together as peers. And also we give that time back to teachers. So we remove one of our Twilight CPD sessions so that teachers feel supported in doing that extra bit of work, of going to observe and being observed. And so lastly, I mentioned that one of our recent reviews was an SEND review. And following on from that, our middle leadership program is going to see a continued focus on securing outcomes for students with SEND, and it's going to need to be a continued focus until we close that gap. So we'll also be conducting another follow-up SEND review, which will involve a broad range of middle leaders as both reviewers and as participants. Also, one of the things that we identified through the student interviews that we did as part of that review, which we would not have noticed just by lesson observations, and was that the struggles that some of them face is really knowing how to revise. And so one of the pieces of work that we're going to be doing is thinking about how we can hold extra sessions for them which really focus on revision, but also make sure that the middle leaders and subject leaders provide specific strategies on exactly how it is that they should be revising for specific subjects. So that concludes my presentation. It's gone very quickly. Thank you so much for listening. Please type any questions that you might have into the chat box, and if I can, perhaps I can say something about how we kind of kept things going during COVID, but I'll wait and see if anyone has any specific questions. Okay, so what resistance or challenges do you get from staff, and how do you overcome them? So I think with regards to, like I mentioned before, like when we've had issues where we felt that middle leaders are not proactive enough, subject leaders aren't proactive enough, or they may be grudging to implement certain priorities, we've actually found that by grouping them together and putting them into these, so the one example was working as a pair with a line manager, that's had a really positive impact. And as far as I am aware, the trios program is just in the process of rolling out at the moment. So me and my group finished our session yesterday. So as far as I see it so far, staff have been very positively engaged in that. We do just have and have always had a culture of that people need to do things, and they do them. And I know that maybe that's not very helpful, and maybe it's a bit difficult for me to unpick it, but we have a very, and actually lots of people have said this who've I've only taught here, but lots of people who have been at lots of different schools often say that the staff culture is really positive and that people are just very game to get involved with things. I think one of the things that probably drives that is that our head teacher was really focused on praise, and she writes people letters all the time thanking them from little things, and she mentions people in her morning briefings on a Monday very frequently to say thank you to them for specific things. So I think the culture of praise, if I was going to have to unpick it, and also the way that we try as much as possible to get people to work together, I think that really helps to stop there from being resistance or challenges with staff. So how do we use our HMI person for review? So what we did the first time was, so actually we do external reviews with challenge partners as well. So we kind of modeled that program a little bit, and this woman and one of her colleagues came in, and we actually kind of designed the program, and then we sent it to her, and she said, well, you know, if I'm looking at students with SEND, well, maybe, it was more able pupils, maybe I should also look at this, and maybe I should also look at that. And when we had her look at our data in the run-up, so that she was able to kind of choose her own trails of what to review. So as I said, the first time that she did it, she did the observations with senior leaders, and I think maybe a couple of middle leaders. But at that point, we made the mistake of only choosing the strongest middle leaders to be involved in the review process, which we now realise was a mistake, because actually it's the subject leaders who who feel less confident that actually get more out of being part of those reviews. So yeah, we used her. She conducted all the student interviews, and we just watched because we knew that was an area that we needed to improve on. She interviewed our subject leaders, and some of us sat in on those meetings. And then she fed back at the end of the day to the head teacher, and then she went away and she wrote up a report. So and that's also sort of the process that we use for our internal reviews. So the next question was, we started our reviews with this one the percentage of staff in the process and its value. Yeah, I think so. It's been a real mix. Like I think the very first review that we did because we felt that department really wasn't in a very good place, but it was still meant to be supportive, and then at other times we have had stronger departments, and then they feed back. But like I said, I personally, from doing the reviews, I learned so much, and that is now our kind of main approach to developing our middle leaders. Is not necessarily that them being reviewed is the thing, or that like that every review captures the most amazing practice, but actually that if the middle leaders are the people leading the review and they see the things that aren't really good practice, they know that, and then that gives them the drive to go back and make sure that things are happening right in their departments. So the champions in the department, they don't necessarily share good practice fortnightly. So it really depends on how the person is leading the session. So sometimes, for example, with the academic literacy one, it started with some theory. So it started with kind of grounding staff in the theory of what the plan was, and then staff going away and doing some reading. So really the first part of the project was them becoming kind of more aware of the research, and then it involved them doing a little project within their own work and feeding back to one another as a group on that. And then after that, it started to involve going back to the department and sharing good practice. So, because one of the issues that you face if you're doing lots of these staff working parties is that you don't want them to kind of get in the way of each other. And recently also we've been having our meetings after school are much shorter because we close the school early so that people can go home. So they feedback more like every 4 or 5 weeks in their department meetings, but they may also email staff in between and set them something to do. Yeah, I think have I answered all the questions that have been posed so far?
I believe so, Lulu. There was one from Lorna just about the champions in the department.
Oh, that was the one I was just answering. Sorry,
yeah.
if that wasn't clear.
Oh, right. Yeah, thanks. That's brilliant. Yeah, and I don't know if there's any other questions. It was. Thank you so much for such a detailed presentation. It was really interesting to hear, particularly about how you had middle leaders involved in the review process. And I think that that's something that we really encourage from a CP point of view as well, is that particularly when schools are hosting their review, that, you know, to get middle leaders involved in that process and begin to articulate your different policies, particularly like around inclusion, vision for the school and stuff, I think is a really interesting take on it, and a great way to obviously develop that leadership capacity for middle leaders as well. So really fantastic. As Lulu mentioned, she kindly shared a few takeaway documents as well. So I will share those with colleagues following this, as well as a feedback form as well. But we'd just really like to say thank you so much for your time, Lulu. I know these things are always strange ending in a virtual platform. There's no great round of applause or cheer, but a virtual round of applause for your time, and we really do appreciate your efforts and energies. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And yeah, and like I said, yeah, I will send around those documents, and thank you all for joining us this morning. It's been fantastic.
Great, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.